Yeah, welcome back to my channel. Here I talk about things I find interesting about African countries or African continents as a whole. Let's talk about Pan-Africanism today. Aside the xenophobic or the Afrophobic attacks we see in South Africa, there are other happenings within Africa that begs the question: is Pan-Africanism spirit still alive in African country or in African continent? Let's ask this question: is Africa holding inside by itself or by Africans? Putting up the holes we see in African continent today, the sieges we have in African continent today, done by Africans themselves. So for Africans, Pan-Africanism was never a slogan. It was a vision. A vision that Africans, no matter where they are from, should believe or know that they share a common identity, a common history, a shared struggle, and a future together. You see, Pan-Africanism idea was very simple, yet very powerful. A kind of idea that believes that Africa must define itself, control its future, control its own resources, and move as one. You see, that was the idea of Pan-Africanism. So you see, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania from Tanzania believes that Africa has to bond together as a continent or a people to make it happen. I'm talking about leaders from Africa, the other Pan-Africanist leaders outside of Africa, but talking about African continent, leaders from these African countries, Pan-Africanist leaders, believes that Africa should also move as one people, no matter where you are. These Pan-Africanist leaders believes that Africa could only move forward if they move together as one. So you see, these leaders pushed for unity, not just in spirit, but in actions also, by what they do. So like what we see happening in South Africa over and over can no longer be tagged as xenophobia attack. It's actually Afrophobia attacks. Because let us call to mind that when South Africa was going through apartheid regime, almost all the African countries rallied around South Africa to support it in every way, be it financial, be it in every way you can never think of. African countries stood firmly in solidarity for South Africans, Black South Africans. You see, that was when the spirit of Pan-Africanism was still very much aflame, was still very much alive. So Pan-Africanism wasn't about ignoring the differences, but about recognizing the differences and also the connections that is between African countries, African brothers, and also the connections that is beyond them. With one voice, with one mind, with one spirit, they stand together, as a people, as a continent. So when Africa acted as one, solidarity was one thing that Africa or Pan-Africanists stood for. They stood for South Africans during the apartheid regime, like I mentioned earlier. They spoke in the World Forum. They spoke about things that are going on in South Africa to make sure that the apartheid regime was dismantled in South Africa and ultimately giving victory to the Black South Africans. And Mandela became the president of South Africa. We see the Pan-Africanism idea or spirit at work during the 1963 formation of the Organization of African Unity, now AU. You see, Africans rallied around each other, countries, to resist colonialism by inspiring other African countries to support independence movements amongst African countries and promote African solidarity and cooperation. That is Pan-Africanism spirit or ideas at work during those times. So you also see the Pan-Africanism idea at work recently, more recently, with the formation of the AfCFTA, the African Free Continental Trade Areas formation, to connect African economies together to work as one, where countries can trade amongst each other in African continent without having to bypass all the hurdles that has to do with financial transactions amongst African economies. So, though the Pan-Africanism idea had no systems put in place to keep pushing it in African continent, but it reflected something very important and should be taught in school more often, that Africa is one wherever you find yourself. You are the same African wherever you are. The ideas must not change. It has to be pushed all across African continent for the younger generations to know that Africa belongs to Africans. And wherever you find yourself as an African, you should be able to live there comfortably and conveniently in any part of African continent. That African strength lies in togetherness and cooperation amongst Africans. Now, the reality on ground in African continent today is far-fetched, considering the number of wars and insurgencies going on in African continent. So this is not just another political issue. It's a moment where Pan-Africanism spirit is being tested, and it should be spread across because Africans or young Africans need to know that they should stand together, that their strength lies in togetherness always. This has to be taught in schools to let them know that this is where how they can defeat whatever that comes in between them. You see, these issues in Africa does not mean that the idea of Pan-Africanism has failed totally, but it means that systems were never put in place to make young Africans or Africans know that they can collaborate together, to teach, to educate them that Africans has to work together. They have to share the same space to make things happen for themselves in Africa. But without structures put in place, Pan-Africanism spirit might become pressure. The unity that Pan-Africanism spirit calls for might become pressure, and pressure turns into conflict. The necessity that Pan-Africanism idea is returned back to African schools. Though Pan-Africanism has to be returned back to school with structures in place, because no matter what it takes, no African country can build itself alone. They need collaboration to build. African economies are connected, and population and migration can never stop in African continent. It's increasing more. Pan-Africanism cannot be an emotional project. It needs structures, and if it's to be done, it has to be done with intentions, to make it work for Africans. So thank you for watching, and see you on the next one.